It was a month ago exactly that we were in Makassar for the International Writers Festival.
Yeah.
And we were singing some of these songs, some in Bahasa Makassar.
Yeah.
We're going to sing a few in English, but we also thought we'd add another Ambonese one.
Yeah.
And Ghana has Ambonese heritage as well.
Yeah, so we're very lucky to learn these Makassar songs. Some of which we learned from my mother, some from Ibu Lily. If you know the words, please do not hesitate to sing along. We hope you enjoy it. Angin memilihku pasang ditujui tongtonganan tu saroha tak lupa Pandumi angin memilih angin yang dingin-dingin dan lorong jenis mata The next song that we have is actually one that we performed at the festival, and Nina wrote it. Very talented Nina. So this is called The Right Place.
Thank you, Jean, for the microphone stand.
One day we went down to the coast, and it's calling us, and some good folk. Oh, how I know I'm gonna dip my toe into the water as the sun goes down. You give your heart to me, and I will look up. And I look over your way. Your smile makes me happy 'cause I know we're in the right place. will slip from your fingertips to the water as the tide pulls out. And you give your heart to me, and I will look up, and I'll look over your head. Your smile makes me happy 'cause I know we're in the right place, and we breathe in the sun and the starlight and out. The birds are singing happy 'cause they know we chose the right way. La 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la. We have one more song tonight, and clap along, click along, sing along if you know the words. Dance along if you feel like it. I won't stop you. Show us a few dances in the art. Ay, mama, jangan mama marah beta. Dia cuma cium beta. Ay, mama, jangan mama marah beta. Lah orang muda punya biasa. Ayam hitam, telurnya putih, mencari makan di pinggir kali. Sinyo hitam, giginya putih, kalau ketawa manis sekali. Ayam mama, jangan mama marah beta. Dia cuma cium beta. Ayam mama, jangan mama marah beta. Lah orang muda punya biasa. Nona bujang, barang piatu, banyak pikiran yang tidak tentu. Pikir begini, pikir begitu, seperti kaca jatuh di batu. Ayo mama, jangan mama marah beta. Dia cuma cium beta. Ayo mama, jangan mama marah beta. Lah orang muda punya biasa. Jalan-jalan ke pasar baru, janganlah lupa beli pepaya. Biar lupa kain dan baju, janganlah lupa kepada saya. Ayo mama, jangan mama marah beta. Dia cuma cium beta. Ayo mama, jangan mama marah beta. Lah orang muda punya biasa. Lah orang muda punya biasa. Terima kasih.
Wow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamal, Hope you enjoyed it. Terima kasih banyak.
Thank you.
Good evening, Adrian. How's the audibility at the back? Okay. My name, well, first of all, thank you very much to Nina and Yana for the marvellous introduction tonight. Members of the Feith family and colleagues and friends, welcome everyone. To start by acknowledging and paying respects to the elders and traditional owners of the land on which this Monash campus stands. My name is Charles Koppel, and I'm a member of the board of the Feith Foundation. I've been asked to chair proceedings and introduce you our speaker this evening, in the absence of the chair of the Feith Foundation board and dean of the Faculty of Arts at Monash University, Professor Ray Francis, who's unable to attend and sends her apologies. When Feith's life was tragically cut short in November 2001, a decision was made to commemorate the life and work of this remarkable volunteer, scholar, teacher, and peace activist who was a dear friend of many of us here this evening. This commemoration of her has taken a number of different forms, which include the Feith Memorial Lecture, which started in 2003 with the late Professor Dan Webb. Tonight's lecture by Adrian Vickers will be, I think, the 11th in the series. Another commemoration of her is in the appointment of Greg Barton in 2007 to the Feith Chair for the study of Indonesia. Further, there was the publication of Gemma Purdy's biography of her from Vienna to Yogyakarta by University of New South Wales Press in 2011 and in Indonesian translation last year in 2014. And finally, the establishment in 2003 of the Feith Foundation, which is sponsoring this event. Set up by the Council of Monash University, the mission of the Foundation is to promote and support work of the kind to which Feith devoted his life. In addition to those already mentioned, it supports other international educational activities in such fields as peace studies, human rights, and conflict resolution. I can only give you a few examples of our work. One area has been supporting study, training, and research. We've supported Feith graduate scholarships in conflict resolution at Gajah Mada University in Yogyakarta, John Darling fellowships for young Indonesian filmmakers, Feith PhD scholarship given to the academic scenario in Jakarta. Another field of support we've given is enabling access to important materials about Indonesia and East Timor, like the digitization of the print editions of Inside Indonesia from its inception in 1983 to 2007, when the magazine became web-based only. Also, the digitization of archival records on East Timor by CHART, the clearinghouse for archival records on Timor. Another area of support has been the translation of Indonesian materials into English. A series of books has already been done, translations of accounts, first-hand accounts of the 1965-66 mass violence in Indonesia. There's a whole string of other publications in the pipeline that we're publishing, especially of translation work. And finally, I mentioned sponsoring events like this lecture, conferences, seminars, film showings, and so forth. We'd like to urge you, if you haven't already done so, and if you have to do so again, to contribute to the Feith Foundation to support our work generally or for particular projects. And for further information, please go to our website, and details you can find on donation forms, which are over here on the small table to the right, my right, your left, over here, where you've got donation forms and prepaid envelopes available for those who would like to take that up. With that preliminary out the way, it's now my pleasure and privilege to introduce this evening's speaker, Professor Adrian Vickers, who holds a personal chair at the University of Sydney. He's a productive and versatile scholar, and his publications have appeared in several editions and have been translated into various languages. I won't go into the detail other than to say they include the book Bali, A Paradise Created, there's a history of modern Indonesia, a book Balinese Art, Paintings and Drawings of Bali, or Drawing of Bali, and with Julian Martinez, The Pearl Frontier, Labour Mobility Across the Australian-Indonesian Maritime Zone, 1870 to 1970. As part of the ARC linkage grant on the history of Balinese painting, he's prepared a virtual museum continuing previous pioneering work in electronic research and teaching. He's been a visiting fellow at Cambridge, at Singapore, at Leiden, has taught at Wollongong and the University of New South Wales, as well as Sydney. We're delighted to have drawn him south of the Murray for work purposes rather than private ones. Tonight, he's speaking to us on the problem
Charles. And first of all, I'd just like to say what an immense honour it was to get the email from Charles to be asked to present the Feith lecture. Although I had been a student of hers, I'd always interacted with him at conferences and spent time dining with him in Georgia with Betty and Feith's Castles, who was also in residence there, and always found her to be an immensely inspiring person. And I know that he's really shaped the careers of many of us here, but also of generations of people in Australia and in Indonesia. So it's a moment of great significance to be able to pay tribute to him. Although having said that, I'm afraid we can't find any connection between her and art. And we've had a number of, I've conferred with a number of people, and there seemed to be no art on Herb's walls. Despite coming from Vienna, he was not necessarily somebody who was particularly into art history. So I'll be talking about art history, but I guess the one link is that I'll be talking about the politics of art history. In this, I've been able to link two separate projects, and one is that I'm currently working, for many years I've been working on Indonesian historiography and the politics of Indonesian historiography, particularly in the post-Suharto period, and then separately I've been working on Balinese art history. And the two, I think, come together in the fact that, as I'll argue tonight, Balinese art history disrupts Indonesian art history. There is a story of Indonesian art and how it evolved from early times until the contemporary, and that story doesn't really take account of the variety of forms of art that exist in Indonesia. And so partly what I want to argue is that we need to expand our understandings of Indonesian art and to rethink the narratives that do exist in order to come to new and more complex understandings of Indonesia. So I'll begin with this work here, which was on the poster, which is quite a remarkable work. We don't know the artist, and it's only through finding some old Dutch newspaper clippings that we even know that this work came from Batuan, the village in central Bali. It was, as far as we can work out, produced in the 1930s. It must have been produced before 1938 when it came to the Netherlands. And that's about as much as we know about it. But it's quite a remarkable work. It doesn't fit within the conventions of art that is usually associated with Balinese tradition. And the use of colour is quite extraordinary. The whole nature of the composition, the way that, although it's a narrative story, it actually is, I guess, concerned with rearrangement of space and understanding of a whole set of different spatial arrangements that, in this case, are associated with a legend about the birth of Bali and how, according to the story, after a disruption on Gunung Agung, Bali's highest mountain, involving a gambling priest, who's the guy who's been burnt up here, the priest's father split Bali from Java and formed the strait that now separates the two islands. So it's a mythological story, but it also has impact by itself. So how do we understand this work, which is very modern? It is, in its style and its characterisation, something that departs from other traditions, but it's very different to what we usually know of modern Indonesian art. And the story of modern Indonesian art is one that usually takes place in Java, particularly Yogyakarta, and also Bandung to some degree, and is usually a story concerned with a number of founding figures from the 1940s onwards, particularly Afandi, one of the most famous, a group of artists who formed an organisation called Persagi, which was affiliated with the nationalist movement and rejected colonialism and colonialism in art to found an Indonesian national art. And in that story of Indonesian art, Bali is a place that Indonesian artists are much like Dutch artists did. Indonesian artists visit Bali for inspiration, but they don't necessarily, in the story, interact with Balinese art. So people like Afandi come and paint the Randa and Barong, which is a kind of tourist scene, so it's not outside of the other conventions of how people looking outside Bali, people outside Bali look into it. And the story of Indonesian art is usually very much mixed up with nationalism and rejection of the Dutch. So the father of modern Indonesian art, Raden Saleh, is seen as a proto-nationalist in the 19th century. This painting, which is originally in a Dutch military museum, when it was returned to Indonesia, has been hailed as a seminal work in terms of formation of modern Indonesian consciousness. It tells of the capture of Diponegoro, depicts Diponegoro in a way that in his exile or in his journey into exile, he remains defiant against colonialism. So it fits very much a nationalist story. In the usual narrative of modern Indonesian art, we jump from Raden Saleh through a bunch of artists who really didn't do much in the way of nationalism, to the Persagi artists, particularly Sugiono, who wrote a famous manifesto challenging Dutch colonial art, or what he called India art, beautiful Indies art, and arguing for an art which engaged with realism and engaged with the people. And Sugiono was later a member of LECRA, the People's Art Movement, which had left-wing affiliations. It's usually associated with the Communist Party, but it was not part of the Communist Party. And Sugiono's break from Dutch colonialism is seen as taking Indonesian art down a leftist stream, although Sugiono was also one who painted Bali and painted idyllic scenes of Bali, such as this 1971 work showing worship in the Balinese temple. And likewise, other political artists from the 50s and 60s, such as Henk Ngantung, painted works based in Bali, supposedly depicting ordinary peasant life, but which was still not that far away from the ideal version of a tourist Bali depicted by the Dutch artists who Sugiono rejected. Actually, there's a mistake there. This is not 1960, this is actually earlier. It's a 1950s work. I took that date from the National the National Gallery catalogue, but I just realised this work actually appears in a catalogue of an exhibition of paintings for the Asia-Africa Conference in Bandung, so it dates to 1955. And in the story of modern Indonesian art, things go wrong in 1965. That is, the social realists and socialist realist artists were suppressed. Many of them were killed, and the stream of art that they represented was replaced by abstract and more decorative art. First of all, from Bandung artists, but also represented by artists like Widayat, you see on your left there. And Widayat isn't abstract, but he comes from a Javanese tradition, or West Javanese tradition, which is very much concerned with decorative art. And that, in a genealogy of modern art, is a story about how art was diamankan, I suppose we'd say pacified, because this kind of decorative art, which fitted in with the idea of art for art's sake, championed by the Cultural Manifesto people, was certainly a respectable and apolitical art for the new order. That is, it was something that was encouraged by the new order because it was a rejection of the political art that had gone before. And in the usual narrative of modern Indonesian art, it's only in the 1970s that you get a break away from the depoliticised art towards a new kind of art, represented by the new art movement, Gerakan Seni Rupa Baru, of which Hardy was one of the key members. And this is actually from a series of protest postcards that Hardy, collaborating with the poet W.S. Rendra, produced in the late 70s and early 80s after Hardy had been detained for depicting himself as president and for a number of other protest activities. And the Gerakan Seni Rupa Baru is usually taken as the moment when not just oppositional art takes off, but also the moment when contemporary art takes off. That is, Indonesian art moves away from a stream of modernism to a series of contemporary engagements that are political, but are not just found in the form of art, but also found in the form of performances, protests, and various other activities. So that's the conventional story. But I think Balinese art disturbs that in many ways. Oh yes, and I should say that it's only in the contemporary art that we do get the kind of direct recognition much after the event of things like the 1965 killings, which were not otherwise depicted, but only in recent years has somebody like Dadang Kristanto, who is more or less outside of Indonesia, is engaged in that work. I just included that these two works at the last minute are in response to Kate McGregor's paper where she talked about Dadang's other works concerned with 1965. But the killings of 1965 and the implications of those do not usually feature in other kinds of Indonesian art, and were only able to be featured after the fall of Suharto and long after the fall of Suharto. So let's go back to Balinese art. So something happens in Balinese art in terms of an experimentation, a move towards engagement with a different, higher forms of reality, and it happens very early on. And this is quite intriguing because whereas conventional Indonesian art did not fit into Asian art histories at earlier stages, Balinese art did as a latter stage of traditional art. And I'm just putting up this work, which has only recently come to light, which is collected by the art historian Ananda Kumaraswamy, which he acquired probably in Batavia in the 1920s. There's a photograph of the work actually probably on sale in the Kunstkring in Batavia. And for art historians like Kumaraswamy, Balinese art represented continuity of ancient traditions. It was traditional in many ways. But in fact, we know from the early 19th century onwards that there were a series of innovations taking place in Balinese art. And one of the earliest markers of this is that Balinese artists were experimenting with paper when they could get hold of it. So we have this extraordinary book of illustrations from the old Javanese Ramayana text, which is now in the National Gallery in Canberra. And they are indications of Balinese artists moving away from tradition towards thinking about different kinds of composition and use of space. And this is early 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, some of these experimental artists were producing quite extraordinary works. some of which still fitted into traditional contexts, such as temples, and that's the work on your right. Others which were on paper making use of new paints, new media to, again, move away from the earlier forms of tradition that you saw in the Kumaraswamy painting into new kinds of forms. And that continued even within traditional styles into the, from the late 19th into the early 20th century as this recent acquisition, also in the National Gallery of Australia, featured in Robin Maxwell's show that she did there, her last show at the National Gallery, demonstrating continuity but experimentation within tradition. And that fairly quickly turned into an experiment with wholly new forms and new depictions. This experiment was really blossoming by the late 1920s, early 1930s. It's been described in a way that domesticates the experiment to colonial paradigms as an experiment deriving from the presence of European artists, particularly Walter Spies, but also Rudolf Bonnet. And as we've seen from the earlier examples, the changes that were going on in Balinese art predate the coming of people like Spies and Bonnet to Bali. And in fact, they were internal to Balinese social change because they were also changes that were taking, I guess, that were being affected by the impact of modernity, that is, by the impact of new technology, the availability of new paints, and by the availability of new audiences for art, that is, tourists, but also others who were willing to actually purchase directly works of art. And so this extraordinary outpouring of new art that begins in the late 1920s is usually associated with the village of Ubud in the middle of Bali, represents another dimension to the changes that were already taking place. Now, this is where the histories of Indonesian art get quite interesting because Rudolf Bonnet, one of the sponsors or one of the people associated with the creation of modern Balinese art, but he was really a kind of entrepreneur or a supporter rather than a creator. Bonnet had the idea of bringing that art to the Netherlands and to the rest of the world. And in the late 1930s, Balinese art was being brought directly to the Netherlands, and some of it was exhibited in some of the most advanced and most contemporary art galleries in Utrecht and Amsterdam, and particularly found their way into the collection and to the Kunsthal, the gallery of Karel van Leer. Van Leer is an interesting character. He was one of the major art dealers of the mid-20th century in Amsterdam. He did have in his stock, or did on sale, a number of more traditional or craft works from Indonesia. But he, at the same time, in his Kunsthal had works by Chagall and Van Gogh and all of the most advanced modern Indonesian artists. And Van Leer was one of the ones who recognised what was going on in Balinese modernism and started to sponsor it. And through Van Leer and through his sale, through his gallery, a number of other Dutch writers, particularly Caspar Niehaus, who was one of the foremost art critics and art historians of the middle of the 20th century, got also interested in Balinese art. This is one of the works that went through Van Leer's collection that has now been lost. It comes from Irene of Batuan, and it would have gone in the same group of paintings that I started my talk with, the painting of the birth of Bali, and Caspar Niehaus was actually the owner or the purchaser of that work, The Birth of Bali. He incorporated this work into his history of Dutch painting. So there is published in around 1940 Niehaus's History of Modern Dutch Art, where he talks about Tulul, where he talks about Hoho. He has a whole chapter on Balinese modern art. So this is an alternative version of art history because although it's still in colonial terms, it's Balinese being produced into Dutch art history, it's bypassing other kinds of histories of Indonesian art. Now, that story got a bit cut off because World War II intervened and the narrative did not go outside the Dutch language, so writers in other languages did not really cotton on to what the Dutch writers like Caspar Niehaus were doing with modern Balinese art. Sadly, one of the reasons that it got derailed was that Vermeer himself was eventually, although he'd been protected for a while, he was Jewish, and eventually, as the war went on, he was taken away and he died in a concentration camp. So his collection was dispersed. There are a few works that his grandson still has, but we don't know where many of the other works went. At the same time, we also have another story of modern Balinese art entering a different discourse of modernity. So the very first, and probably up until now, the only works of Indonesian art that have been shown in the Mecca of modern art, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, are Balinese modernists. And these were works that were from a show put together by the anthropologist Gregory Bateson in 1943. When it was a touring show, there's a whole other history. The title is quite bizarre. It's about why people should be interested in Bali because when American troops arrive there, they want to know about post-war reconstruction. It's a kind of, you can see, when you're writing a grant and you're trying to fit it into national exigencies and national priorities, that Bateson was trying to figure out, how can I have an exhibition on Bali in the middle of World War II? I know, I'll make it about what people need to understand for post-war reconstruction. But he toured, he exhibited Balinese works in MoMA, and then toured this exhibition around the US. This is actually the only photograph that we have of the exhibition actually on show, and it's at Yale University. We don't have any photographs of it at MoMA. And it was an anthropology exhibition, but a lot of the people who went along because they were interested in the works of modern art that were on show. And the original MoMA showing did have a narrative about the very early movements towards modernism by Balinese artists. And these are two of the works that were included. More or less, most of the show is still actually in the Library of Congress. It didn't end up with Bateson and these other works. And you have to go to Washington and I'll get it out for you and you can play around with all these pieces. So this work by Arnold Nesselbrat, one of the people regarded as a pivotal figure in the development of Balinese modernism in Ubud. These are two of his works there. Also a number of works by Hustinjong and Limpad, including this extraordinary depiction of the story of Pan Brayut, who goes and meditates in a graveyard when he's moving into later stages of life. It's kind of pension plan when you go into retirement, what you do when you go into retirement, meditating graveyards. And other artists, particularly the ones from Batuan, where our first painting came from, such as Ido Bagus Bala, who was a very adventurous and quite extraordinary artist, and Bateson and Mead, the anthropologists, collected a lot of works by him. And this guy, who also disturbs the national narrative again. Nyawa Ngendon was an artist who was important in the village of Batuan, where he stimulated his fellow artists to get involved in modernism and different forms of experimentation with modern art. But Ngendon then went off to Yogyakarta and joined Persagi, the movement of Afandi and Sugiurno. We don't know much about what he did in Persagi. We still got to find out details, but certainly by 1946 he was back in Bali organising for the revolution and organising resistance against the Dutch, and in fact he was captured by pro-Dutch forces in Gianyar and taken to the graveyard in Batuan and executed for his role as a Pemuda. So this is also doesn't fit within the normal ideas of how we think about modern artists and revolutionary artists, but Ngendon certainly was part of that, and he was interested in experimenting with forms of art that also both took advantage of the lessons from the West, but also changed the ideas of Western art into Balinese terms. And this, a more conventional work of his showing a Ramayana scene, is an example of part of a much larger range of works that Ngendon executed. Now, one of the people that Ngendon influenced was Bagus Madi Togok, whose career spanned the period from the 1930s until his death in the 1980s. And myself and Hildred Getz were lucky enough to interview and be able to spend a lot of time talking to Bagus Togok, who narrated a lot of aspects of this period, and Hildred Getz has published his stories of his own life history and his own engagement with art. But this extraordinary and very disturbing work by Bagus Togok was part of Bateson's exhibition, and it's a self-portrait, but done in a very weird way, which departs from other Balinese conventions, and I think engages with Bateson and Mead's interest in Freudian psychology and dreams and the modern world, but does so in a way that's entirely unexpected. And this is moving the modern into another dimension, I think. Also quite extraordinary was another one of the artists with whom Bateson and Mead interacted, who was part of the Batuan artists' engagement with the Pitamaha Artists Association. So one of the artists whom Rudolf Bonnet presented to Europe, and that's Dewa Kompiang Kandor Ruka, who was active in the 1930s. This work was included in the MoMA show, and it's still in the Library of Congress collection, but it's an extraordinarily abstract work. It's a work that is kind of decorative, but it's also representational. It does a number of things at the same time. It's very hard to see until you look up close, but what it's doing is actually showing a depiction of Balinese village life in a really weird way. It combines different planes and gives a number of different perspectives. Somebody said it's as if he's sitting up a very high tree and looking down on the village, but doing so in a way that totally abstracts any of the representational features. And we see this in other works by Kandor Ruka, this one in the Museum Puri Lukisan, which originally the art historian Jean Couteau said, oh, this must have been inspired by Escher. Except we did the dates, and it's much more likely that Escher was inspired by Kandor Ruka, given that Escher was a friend of Bonnet's and that they knew each other in the 1930s. It's quite likely that Escher, around 1936 or 37, would have seen works like this by Kando Ruka. So again, we get a different story about modern art. These are other works by Kando Ruka, some of which are mythological, such as this depiction of the historical figure Batu Lepang, who was somebody who's actually recorded in Dutch VOC accounts of the history of Bali. And then these other kinds of depictions which show you how Kando Ruka evolved into abstraction from a more representational style of art, including this one, which has a mythological scene from the Ramayana up the top, but yet again these combinations of foliage and village scenes down the bottom into this work, which is probably his purest and most abstract of works, and quite extraordinary. And I should say for Jokowi fans that in the 1950s, Kando Ruka gave up painting and became a furniture salesman. So, which, yeah, don't know what that was about. Okay, just to give you a sense that the variety of forms of modern art, we have again another artist who was working actively in the 1930s, Made Picha, who not only did works of his own, again experimenting with forms, experimenting with mythological scenes, but also he was also engaged in colouring the work of other artists. So there was an interactive dimension to what he was doing. But Made Picha also was somebody who joined the revolution, who was a Pemuda, who was he was from the village of Sanur. He was killed in Sanur, and there's actually a park dedicated to him as a Pahlawan Revolusi in Bali. So again, these stories of engagement with modernity lead on to other ideas of different kinds of politics. And that move of 1930s art carried over into later periods, when people like Rudolf Bonnet wanted to domesticate what they were seeing in Balinese art. They talked about it as a move to depicting everyday life. But in fact, many of the Balinese artists were still concerned with depicting mythological scenes in a way that engaged in what we might call history painting. That is, they were also interested in depicting things that were going on around them, whether these were domestic scenes, such as Bagus Nyoman Rai's rather humorous depictions of some of his fellow villagers and the Westerners with whom he interacted, or again in the case of Bagus Nyoman Rai, an event like a whale being beached in Sanur and people slicing up bits of the whale to take home for dinner, which took place sometime in the 1960s on the beach of Sanur. So this is a kind of realism, but it also represents a very playful experimentation with ways of showing reality. And that particular work has been inspirational for other artists, such as the contemporary present-day Indonesian artist Teja Astawa, another Balinese who works in, I think he's based in Kuta, but he is somebody who's engaged in Indonesian contemporary art, but in a way that draws on Balinese traditions. And we have an example of that there. Likewise, the depiction of life in an almost overdetermined way comes out in more famous artists such as Iwayan Bendi, whose work from the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s included these depictions of Bali that are playful depictions of the nature of tourism, the impact of commercialisation on everyday life, and the idea of Balinese somehow maintaining their own cultural life in the face of tourism and in the face of an overabundant Bali or an overdetermined Bali. So the depiction of reality, or different forms of reality, is something that went in a particular direction in Bali, and although it has playful dimensions, is also significant to Balinese art. Which brings me to this work, which I haven't actually seen in person, but I found in the catalogue of the National Museum. So on this trip to Jakarta, I'm going to be bashing on their doors to try to find out a bit more about this. In the mid-1960s and late 1960s, early 1970s, a group of artists in Penestanan, a village which adjoins Ubud, started their own new experimentation. These were called the Young Artists. They were associated with peasant art, and they were influenced by the Dutch-turned-Indonesian artist Ari Smit, who gave them lots of colours and said, "Go for it, guys. This is see what you can do." And they did these extraordinary works. However, in more recent times, I've heard a little bit, and it's hard to get an accurate picture, that many of these peasant artists were also associated with left-wing movements. And this story is a mythological story. It's the story of Jayaprana, who was a pati, a minister of a king who was unjustly murdered by the king, so the king could steal his wife from him. But the murder of the innocent Jayaprana brought about a terrible cataclysm where everybody in the kingdom turned on each other and the kingdom more or less self-destructed. So what Iputut Soki, one of the founding members of the Young Artists School, has done here is depicted that last scene from Jayaprana where the palace of the king is in chaos. Jayaprana and his wife, who has committed suicide so that she could be joined with him, are being borne off to heaven, and everybody is going crazy. The king and his wife are killing each other, and everybody is killing each other. This was painted in 1965. So we do indeed have depictions of what was going on, but this is a rare glimpse into how Balinese art could come to terms with the events. So it's a significant work, and I think it disturbs many of our notions of what was going on in art and what artists were concerned with. Okay, I'll just move on very quickly because I wanted to also talk about in art history terms how we might then rethink a number of aspects of modern and contemporary art. And there are a number of later Balinese artists. Dewa Mokok, who was active from the 1970s up until his death a couple of years ago, for example, is somebody who takes elements of Balinese art that moves into another plane. And those of you who've read my book on the history of Balinese painting will have seen there a work by Mokok in which he depicts the Bali bombings of 2005. And he's concerned both with daily life but also the interventions of the supernatural into daily life. His student was Kadek Muniasi, who tragically died very young, but she takes us from what Mokok was doing into full-on contemporary art, in that she was very much engaged as one of the leading Indonesian women artists of her time, with confronting ideas of gender and sexuality in a way that was much more challenging and much more daring than what many other of the contemporary artists were doing. And as I said, it's tragic that she died so young in 2006 and was not able to continue that work. But again, that raises this question of what is contemporary art, that when we think about the kinds of things that are presented as contemporary art in art catalogues, in art museums, and certainly in the art market, Indonesian contemporary art is one of the flavours of the month. It's something that is achieving very high value. We have already one Indonesian contemporary artist who's work is sold for more than $1 million US, and regularly Indonesian contemporary artists sell for figures in the hundreds of thousands. But what I'd say is that many of these Indonesian contemporary artists, including some who come from Bali but are based in Jogja, such as Putu Sudarjaya, are less contemporary than some of the earlier Balinese artists who were doing much more daring and interesting and innovative experimental works. And it's also intriguing that some of the leading Indonesian contemporary artists such as Heri Dono, Dadang, Kristanto, Hardy, all of those artists go to Bali and have looked at Balinese art in different ways. These are some works I photographed recently in Heri Dono's studio, where he has in his collection a Balinese wayang of the Rangda, so a shadow puppet figure, but he's put it in his own installation. But that very much informs his other kinds of work, such as his version of the demon Ra, or the head of the demon Ra trying to eat the moon, which is a mythological work conventionally shown in Balinese art. So the Bali story then makes us reconsider what we know about other aspects of Indonesian art history. But if you take out the conventional narrative that goes from Raden Saleh to Sugiono Kosagi to the post-65 abstract artists into contemporary art, then you find all kinds of interesting other stories in Indonesia. And so I just want to leave you with the thought that we still have so much more to do in terms of unearthing different aspects of Indonesian art history. So, for example, you go to the Tropen Museum in the Netherlands. It's not called the Tropen Museum, it's now part of the Amalgamated World Museum with the Leiden Ethnographic Museum, but it's still the same building in Amsterdam. You'll see these two works, which obviously came out of a wayang tradition, but they're not standard wayang works. They include other kinds of representation. They were, as far as anybody knows, we don't know anything much about them except that they were painted by somebody called Tirto from Gresik, and possibly around 1900, and I think that date is when they entered a Dutch collection. So here's a little enigma. Where does somebody like Tirto of Gresik fit into art history? And if you go back further, we find that, in fact, in the 18th and 19th century, the Japanese artists were also doing very interesting things. They were working with wayang, that is, with depictions of the shadow theatre, but depicting other aspects of life in very adventurous ways, as this Damawulan manuscript from the British Library, which shows domestic scenes and strange interactions between Europeans and others and Javanese, in a way that also doesn't fit some of our conventional narratives and seems to be a commentary on the nature of colonialism. And if you go online to the British Library website, you actually find a lot of these manuscripts have already been digitised, which is quite marvellous, and you can see other scenes from this Damawulan work, but also the later Selat Selarasa, dated to 1804. Again, a mythological story with wayang basis, but incorporating other kinds of depiction that draw on a whole series of conventions, perhaps related to Japanese art, perhaps related to Indian art, incorporating motifs and things from textiles, but things like this wonderful depiction of a Dutch ship, and this particular manuscript has a whole series of nautical images of Dutch ships, again representing a new kind of reality. Or, and here is a plug for all of you, if you haven't gone there already, to go to the NGV, where there's a show on at the moment on theatre and art which includes this wonderful Dewa Ruchi manuscript that they have dated to 1882. And again, it's a Wayang manuscript, but it includes all of these other kinds of depictions. There's again, nautical scenes of Dutch ships, these scenes of animals, scene of Bima by the seashore, again trying for a different kind of experiment with representational reality, and probably contemporary with the work of Raden Saleh, but belonging to a quite different stream of art, and one that fits in with what is still lively and significant in Java, popular art, such as these kinds of representations, transient as they are, that you will find in different sites, in coming and going in different places in Java. And we also have artists who are part of that folk tradition, including my friend Jumadi, Australian-based, but very much drawing on some of these alternative traditions in his own Indonesian contemporary art. And likewise, if we go to Sumatra, you can see Sumatra also has long visual traditions, these wonderful Lampung textiles. The one on the right is from the, you're right, is from the NGV as well. And again, these represent Wayang figures, but they also have a different kind of representational, decorative, but still significant kind of role in which different forms of space, different forms of arrangement in space take place. And we know that there were other artists, at least from the early 19th century, active in Java. The British East India Company, when they had their base at Bengkulu, commissioned artists such as this anonymous artist who depicted the House of Raffles in Bengkulu. This is the back view of Raffles' house, looking out his back door. And we don't know who the artist was, whether this was somebody brought from India to work in Sumatra, whether he was a local Chinese artist, whether he was a local Indonesian artist. There are mysteries that abound. Likewise, we have in the Leiden Ethnographic Museum collection a series of works depicting life in Aceh around the beginning of the 20th century, or perhaps at the end of the 19th century, by an artist. And again, we only know his name, Tengku Tungo. Sorry, my Achenese is totally deficient. But these are also extraordinary depictions belonging to some other kind of alternative, we might call it a folk tradition, an alternative representational depiction, depicting forms of daily life, religious life, in a way that most people who think about Islamic art think, oh, that doesn't actually involve representational art. But quite clearly here we have scenes of what life was like in Aceh at the time by a gifted and very talented artist whose work is not a million miles away from the kinds of Balinese art that I've just shown you. I can see this as being of a kind with Wayan Bendi's depictions of Bali and Bali's interaction with tourism, but some 70 or 80 years earlier and at the tip of Sumatra. So I just want to leave you with a big question mark, that once we start to look at Balinese art and start to look at it with fresh eyes, to throw out a lot of the earlier narratives, that we can use the same critical view of Indonesian art history to start to examine a whole series of other forms of art. And I hope, and particularly for the young scholars amongst you, that people will be getting out there and trying to find more examples of what happens in Gresik, what happens in Aceh. People like the Tengku must have left other works of art. There must be more than just these 4 particular works that ended up in Leiden. So we want to know what happened to those other art histories? Are there works of this type in Makassar, in Ambon? Are there other Indonesian artists who were part of alternative streams? So I think the field is wide open, and it remains for us to start to do our research. So thank you.
We have some time for questions to Adrian. Just before I call for questions, I should come partially to the defence of the Feith family on the art in their home. My memory is that they had a set of those amazing 5 volumes, I think it is, of the collection of President Sukarno that was published in Beijing, I think, which were a whole lot of Indonesian painters. And I think that the Feith children enjoyed these very much. How much of them I can't say, but my memory certainly tells me that that was something that may not have been things on the wall, but there was this collection of volumes of the Sukarno collection. Now, questions? Yes, David.
Thanks for a great talk, Adrian. Just on your point about the Balinese method in adopting paper, in the Kamasan painting behind you, there's another example of when Balinese keep it up with the latest technology, because the red colour is ginju, which is Chinese lipstick. So they've been importing the latest for a long time. I actually wanted to ask you a question related to them dealing with 65. It only showed us one painting, but you know, there's Romarone's thesis about the Sanyang Magana. That's just an old purified village. And Mary Loves has written about various propitiation of ghost operation in West Bali. But there must be more at dealing with this propitiation of ghosts in Balinese painting.
Well, yeah, so indirectly, I mean, that's, I guess, the most direct example I can find, but certainly so if we think about Hildred Geertz's analysis of 1930s Balinese art, which is also has lots of scenes of exorcism and so on, and this was at a time of great poverty and also of disease outbreaks and so on. But yeah, certainly at a later time we get the same kinds of depictions of exorcistic dances, exorcistic performances, and we know that Balinese were setting up shrines or surreptitiously doing things to propitiate the souls of the dead who otherwise could not be officially cremated or officially dealt with. That was very much a present force. So yeah, this is one example of what I think is a much larger phenomenon, but it's the most direct one I can find. Yeah.
No question. Yes. David. Seems to be only David's that ask questions.
Adrian, a question from someone who knows nothing about art of any national kind. You made references a little bit to the impact of tourism over various decades. I wonder if you could elaborate on that. I mean, to what extent is there a kind of bifurcation between the kind of art that you're talking about and the kind of art that most Australians would see if they go to Bali? I mean, at what point do they intersect? What are the kind of financial drivers that lead to the production of particular art forms here that you're talking about, as opposed to other paintings that people might see on the side of the road?
Yeah, that's a complex story, and you'll have to read my book to get the full version. But it does seem that in the post-war period, that there's there is a hiatus in Balinese art where a lot of the people who were involved in art in the 1930s, like Kandor Ruka, who went into the furniture business, can no longer make a living from art, and so they go into other things, and then the tourist art comes to fill the gap, so you get these scenes of happy people in the rice fields and so on, and that from the late 1960s onwards becomes the way that Balinese think, well, this is probably what's going to make me a quid while I try and do other things. But for the most interesting artists, they were still doing all the other things at the same time, but maybe going and doing it for themselves. So somebody like Iba Wisnyoman Rai, who also, as well as his whale scenes and his scenes of sexual interaction between Balinese and Westerners, also did a number of works on the 1963 eruption of Gunung Agung, and he earlier on had done works on the Japanese period. That he was somebody who, because he had a number of patrons, didn't need to worry about what he was doing, so he'd just go and do his own thing, and a number of those artists did continue to do their own thing. So the two kinds of art, the more interesting and more meaningful art, coexists with the stuff that's just produced to make a quid. But I don't necessarily see it as a bifurcation, because you might go into a gallery, well, at least before people realised what this was worth, and have found one of the interesting works hanging in the corner somewhere with a number of the tourist works. So I think they coexisted for a lot of people. Yeah, maybe Sharon.
What was the influence of photography on the experimentation of ways of depicting art?
Okay, that's a whole PhD. PhD of that. Photography is intriguing because we do have a number of people taking photographs. So you get Balinese, and then later on, you get Western, but then also Chinese, and even a Japanese photographer taking photographs in Bali from fairly early on, producing for the main a number of standard scenes which are also the standard scenes of tourist art, and including things like photographs of the Kechak dance, mountain scenes and so on. And so in terms of subject matter, there seems to be a kind of interaction. But I guess for Balinese artists, photography meant a kind of realism, but one that was not something where they could incorporate mythological scenes into photography. So it remained another kind of art outside of what the artists were interested in. And in terms of technology, of course, the Balinese artists could not afford cameras. But there is an impact in terms, I think, of seeing photographs and seeing what was going on. And certainly when we look at the Batuan artists from the 1930s and see the heavy influence of all of this stuff being in black and white, you have to immediately think, photography. But we don't know much more than that.
Margaret and then Aaron.
Adrian, thank you very much for a wonderful lecture. Not only for the ideas, but the gorgeous visuals.
Yeah.
So it's just a pity the rest of the world can't see them. Can you tell us a little bit about your virtual museum of Balinese art?
Okay. Yeah.
The history of that and how it's related to Eve, to the cloud and all that. Because any of this still going up to the cloud sometime and won't be available to people like me who'd love to look at it more often.
Okay. So the Virtual Museum of Balinese Painting is, I should work out, we can circulate the URL if you like, but it has a publicly accessible version. There are some works that are not included because we still have to get all the copyright clearances and so on. But we do have about 3,000, I think, Balinese meetings already up there on show. So, and you can see it in terms of, I'm just looking at Jarrah because he's my research assistant on the project. It's actually grouped in a number of ways. So you can look up individual artists like Christian Lampard, or you can look it up in terms of collections. So you can see which works went through the Valia collection, for example, or works that were collected by Gregory Bateson and Margaret Mead, or other works that are in Leiden and so on. But also then I've organised it in terms of narratives that are depicted mythological narratives. So it's reasonably self-evident once you get the URL.
Can I suggest, Adrian, if you can supply me with the URL,
yep.
I can do two things with it. I'll circulate it to people who are subscribers to the Indonesian Forum email list that I've said put in a plug at this point. If you want to be on that list and learn about forthcoming events, especially within Victoria, then get in touch with me by email, c.koppel, C-O-P-P-E-L, at unimelb, UNINELB.edu.au, and I can put you onto the Indonesian Forum list. We've got a bit over 400 people on that list at the moment, but the more the merrier. I can circulate it there. Gemma, I think, can put it up on the Earthbeat website for those of you who want to access it from there, and that will provide you with a link then, one way or the other, from which you can get to this fantastic resource. Next, Marion.
Yes, please do circulate the URL. I'm speaking also from ignorance, but it seemed to me that there was a theme that you were not fully expressing in terms of the contrast between, say, Javanese and Balinese developments. And as a historian, a cultural historian, I'd like to know whether the fact that the Balinese didn't have a Muslim influence upon them, and that they were able to keep on integrating their ritual life and their mythological understanding in a way that, well, maybe if you do it in Georgia, but not so much, that is a base for a different kind, well, what we're seeing there looks to me like a continuous development based on that kind of cultural richness, mythological richness, which doesn't exist so much. And that the larger influence of the Western movements upon Javanese and other sorts of Indonesian art, the more obvious ones, are because they haven't got that strong representational mythological tradition. Am I mistaken?
Probably not. In this, I don't think that we can see Islam in those terms, because Islam has a rich visual history in Indonesia, and
But it's not mythological representation.
it's not. Well, some of it is, but in a less direct fashion. But I think that there's actually a simpler kind of deterministic, material deterministic aspect to it, in that the advent of tourism in Bali is really what makes a difference, because it supplies a market for artists in the 1930s. So people who might have been doing other things see that they can get involved in art and experiment and do quite amazing things, and they're kind of competing with each other to see who can come up with the most interesting aspect for it. So it's the absence of that tourist market in Java, and for art, I mean, there's a market for other kinds of things, but the absence of that tourist market in Java or Sumatra or Aceh, that really means that the arts go in a completely different direction. And that in Aceh, it's more things like textiles or other kinds of arts that are important. That's why I think there are enough traces, and it's also that people haven't done enough looking to see what else was there, that we don't really know the story. But there's nothing like a good bit of materialism to answer some of the cultural questions. Yeah.
Got two more people please lined up. At the back, Robin Maxwell, and then Lisa Holmes.
The voice I have to do. I have laryngitis. But my question is somewhat related, but not. You're proposing an alternative art history trajectory to run Saleh onwards. And you're proposing, I presume again, that you have other alternatives that might be there. Is the problem, as it was with the Dutch also, or with the Europeans, is that you're equating art with painting. And at the moment you do that, Bali has a certain advantage over all of Southeast Asia except Thailand, where painting on walls, on things, was far more important for all sorts of reasons. Now, of course, there have been historical changes that have meant that painting may be less the case in other parts, but really, if you start to talk about history as painting, then you, of course, limit yourself to certain parts of Southeast Asia from time immemorial.
Indeed, and Burma actually is the other one that has especially in Thailand, Cambodia, Burma, Laos, but not Vietnam, not Malaysia in the same way. Yeah, that's true. I mean, I'm really dealing with Seni Rupa, with particularly painted art, and not sculpture or other aspects. But I think one of the remarkable things about Bali, and again, this may be to do with markets, it may be to do with particular forms of interaction. I think it's more than just the absence of Islam, is that Bali also has an abundance of sculpture, of different textile forms, dance, theatre, and so on. So it's not an either or in the case of Bali. It's more like an overabundance in that case. But yeah, that is true. This is to do with a particular kind of art history, which is about painting, and there are completely different narratives that you can tell about other parts of the world. But what I think intrigues me at the moment, particularly with the advent of contemporary Southeast Asian art into this large market and the whole change in the art market in global terms, but also in the way that it's affected Asia, is that it is painting that becomes one of the most easily saleable, marketable forms within the auction house and within a number of other histories. And I guess I'm disturbed by the fact that some of the people who come from outside into Southeast Asian art tend to act as if there is no history, or that the history of that art is irrelevant. So what I'm asking is for a return to art history and the importance of art history, but it's got to be a complicated art history because it is a multifaceted story.
Lisa?
I just wondered in terms of colonial competition and whether there are reflections of that in Balinese art.
Yeah, there are certainly depictions and engagements with the colonial in Balinese art, but often not necessarily directly, more in terms of a response to overall change that's going on in the island. But some of these people, particularly Nyoman Yendom, who I mentioned before, were not afraid to depict the colonial context that they were working in. but sometimes more as a kind of humorous form, and also with a kind of quizzical engagement with what was going on. There's a bunch of very strange works which may or may not be by Nguyen Don, just depicting aspects of modern life. And one of these includes a Dutchman on his knees in front of a Balinese Raja. So this is a fairly direct kind of comment, and certainly one that you wouldn't expect to find in that colonial context.
Well, any remaining question? I think Adrian has been extraordinarily generous with answering questions, and it remains to me to thank him on behalf of you all. It's been a quite rich and rewarding lecture in terms of the coverage that he's given us and the images that he's shown us and the complexity of the story that he's told us. I'd like to you all to join me in thanking him, and I'd like to present him with a small token of my appreciation.
The latest book that Julia Martinez and I have written on the curling industry. And if you go to Paul Thomas, you can actually see one of the few copies that are available at the moment.